I served champagne at my sister's wedding, while federal agents watched the groom's father from across the tent. My mother handed me a black polyester apron 3 weeks before my sister's wedding and said, "It's just easier this way, Liv, you understand." I did not understand. I stood in my parents' kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, holding an apron that still had the tag on it, and I asked her to repeat what she just said. Because some part of my brain refused to process it the first time. "The photographer needs the wedding party to look a certain way," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Chloe wants the pictures to be perfect. And honestly, sweetheart, with everything going on with the seating chart and the catering staff being short, it just makes more sense for you to help out that way. You'll still be there. You'll still see everything. I'll still see everything." As if that was the part I should be grateful for. I'm 31 years old. I have a master's degree. I have a job that, according to my family, doesn't really sound like anything. I work in fraud, risk, and compliance for a regional financial group, doing forensic reviews on suspicious account activity and flagging things that don't add up before they become six-figure disasters. My parents have described this job to their friends, when they bother to describe it at all, as Olivia does paperwork for a bank. My mother has said, more than once in front of me, "Chloe's the one with the eye for beautiful things." Olivia's more practical. Practical is the word they use instead of the word they actually mean, which is plain. Chloe is 28, works part-time at a boutique event planning company our father's business partner owns, and is, by every objective measure, stunning. She has been the center of every family photograph since she was 6 years old and I was 9, and I stopped noticing it as an insult somewhere around my 20th birthday. Because what was the point? That's just how our family sorted us. Chloe was the pretty one. I was the smart one, which in my family was a consolation prize, not a compliment. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I loved my sister. I still do, even after everything. This isn't a story about hating Chloe. This is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you decide, quietly and then not so quietly, that you're an embarrassment to manage rather than a daughter to love. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in October, at the Whitfield family's estate in Litchfield County, 22 acres, a restored 1890s carriage house converted into a reception hall. A tent company flown in from Manhattan because the local ones wouldn't understand the aesthetic. Chloe's fiancé, Tyler Whitfield, came from money. Not new money. Old, quiet, understated money, the kind that doesn't wear logos. His father, Richard Whitfield, ran an investment firm called Meridian Capital Partners out of a converted mill building in Kent, and every time Richard spoke at a family dinner, my parents leaned forward like he was dispensing scripture. My father had, I would later learn, put a significant portion of his and my mother's retirement savings into one of Richard's private funds 18 months earlier. I didn't know that yet. Nobody told me anything in my family unless it made me useful. The exclusion started small, the way these things always do. I wasn't asked to be a bridesmaid. Chloe chose 4 college friends and a cousin instead, which stung, but I told myself it was her day and her choice. Then I wasn't invited to the engagement photos, because it's just going to be Chloe and Tyler and the parents, very intimate, you understand. Then, at the dress fitting for the mother of the bride and family portraits, my mother texted me a photo of swatches and said, "We're doing champagne and sage for everyone in the photos. But don't worry about getting a dress yet, we're still figuring out logistics for you." Logistics for me. Like I was a rental chair that needed placement. The night she handed me the apron, I asked her directly, "Am I in the wedding photos or not?" She sighed, the particular sigh she reserves for when I make her say true things out loud. Richard's photographer does a very specific style, editorial, very curated. And Chloe wants the whole aesthetic to be cohesive, and I think if we're being honest, Liv, you'd feel more comfortable behind the scenes than posed up front anyway. You've never liked having your picture taken. That was a lie she'd told so many times she believed it. I don't dislike having my picture taken. I dislike having my picture taken next to my sister, standing in a family that photographs her like a magazine cover and photographs me like an afterthought that wandered into frame. And the waitressing, I asked. The catering company is short 2 servers for the cocktail hour, and Richard's assistant thought, well, we thought. Your father and I thought, it would be nice if you were doing something rather than just standing around. You're so practical, you're good in a crisis. We just think you'd be more comfortable with a role. A role. I was being assigned a role in my own sister's wedding, and the role was invisible labor. I should have said no. I want to be honest about that too. Nobody made me put on that apron. I put it on myself, on an unseasonably warm October afternoon, in a converted carriage house that smelled like white lilies and candle wax, because some small, humiliated 12-year-old part of me still wanted to be let back into the family portrait, even from the side of the room, even holding a tray. The wedding itself was, by any measure, obscene in its scale. 240 guests, an orchestra for the ceremony and a 12-piece band for the reception. A raw bar flown in on ice from Boston. I found out later the flowers alone cost more than my annual rent. And threaded through the crowd, in tuxedos and cocktail dresses, were men my father kept calling Richard's investors. A phrase he said with a kind of reverent hush, like he was naming saints. I worked the cocktail hour in the black apron, carrying trays of crab toast and champagne. Invisible in the specific way that service staff are invisible to people who have never had to be service staff. I watched my mother laugh with her hand on Richard Whitfield's arm. I watched my father corner 2 older men by the bar, nodding intensely at whatever they were saying. I watched Chloe Luminous do a slow spin in her dress for a cluster of admirers while the photographer, the editorial one, the curated one, circled her like a satellite. Nobody looked at me. That was the design, and for the first 90 minutes, it worked exactly as intended. And then I started actually listening to what my father's 2 older gentlemen were discussing, because listening to conversations you're not supposed to be part of is, unfortunately, most of my actual job. Told me the Q3 statements would be out by the 15th, and it's the 22nd, one of them was saying, low, needling. Richard's been dodging my calls. He's got a lot going on, the other one said, gesturing vaguely at the tent, the band, the raw bar. Clearly business is good. Clearly, the first one repeated, in a tone that didn't sound reassured at all. I want to explain something about my job that my family never bothered to understand. I don't do paperwork. For the past 4 years, I've worked on a joint task force between my firm and 2 regional banks, flagging structured deposits, ghost LPs, and funds that promise steady, improbable returns regardless of market conditions, funds that, on paper, never have a bad quarter. 6 weeks before that wedding, my team had opened a file on a boutique Connecticut investment firm after 3 different institutions, flagged unusual wire patterns, moving through the same holding entity. I'd seen the entity's name exactly once, in a spreadsheet, at 11 o'clock at night, underlined in red by my supervisor, Meridian Capital Partners, LLC. I did not, at the dress fitting that wasn't, at the engagement party I wasn't invited to, at any point until I was standing in that tent with a tray of crab toast. Connect the name of my future brother-in-law's father to the file sitting open on my work laptop. Why would I? My family had spent months making sure I was the last person consulted about anything related to this wedding. I set the tray down behind the bar, took out my phone under the pretense of checking the time, and texted my supervisor, Priya, one line, "Is the Meridian file still open? I think I'm at their event right now." She called me back within 4 minutes, which for Priya, who does not get excited, told me everything I needed to know. I'm not going to pretend the next 2 hours were glamorous, or that I had some cinematic moment of clarity. Mostly I kept serving drinks with a phone buzzing in my apron pocket, while Priya and 2 colleagues from the joint task force compared notes against what I could feed them, the names of investors I overheard. The specific language Richard used when a guest asked him about the fund's incredible consistency. The fact that he'd apparently promised several people a minimum 11% return, no matter what the market's doing, which is the kind of sentence that makes everyone in my line of work sit up straight. Because markets don't work that way, and any fund that claims otherwise is either lying or stealing. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew for certain until that night, was that Richard had been running a classic Ponzi structure for nearly 3 years. New investor money paying out returns to older investors, no actual trading strategy behind most of it, and a personal spending pattern that included, among other things, a 22-acre estate and a wedding for his son that cost more than most of his investors' annual salaries. My father's retirement account was in there. So was the account of the older gentleman by the bar who couldn't get his Q3 statement. So, we would later learn, were the retirement accounts of 11 other people standing in that tent in cocktail attire, eating crab toast off my tray, congratulating themselves on being close enough to Richard Whitfield to get an invitation. The toasts happened, the first dance happened. I stood at the edge of the tent in my black apron and watched my sister sway in the arms of a man whose father was, at that exact moment, the subject of an emergency coordination call between 2 federal agencies and my supervisor, because what I'd fed them that night had corroborated 8 months of quieter suspicion and given them, finally, enough live, in-person confirmation of specific victims and specific promises to move. They didn't wait for a better moment. I've since been told that in cases with active flight risk and a large concentration of victims in one physical location, agents will sometimes move immediately rather than risk losing the opportunity. Richard Whitfield had a passport, a private plane on retainer, and as it turned out, a shell account in the Caymans that had received an unusually large transfer 4 days earlier. They weren't going to wait for the cake. It happened during the toasts to the parents, right after Tyler's mother finished a tearful speech about watching her son fall in love. 2 men in plain suits walked to the edge of the dance floor, and a third spoke quietly to the venue coordinator. And within 90 seconds, the 12-piece band had gone silent, and Richard Whitfield was being asked, calmly, by federal agents to step outside. I have never in my life seen 240 people go silent that fast. Chloe's face, I will remember Chloe's face for the rest of my life, not confusion. Recognition, arriving a half-second too late, the way you recognize you've been standing on thin ice only once you feel it crack. Tyler moved to go after his father, and one of the agents said something to him, quiet, that made him stop where he stood. My mother found me 20 minutes later behind the bar, where I hadn't moved, because I genuinely did not know what my legs were supposed to do with this information. She grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark and hissed, "Did you know about this? Did you know?" "I didn't know Richard was involved in anything until tonight," I said, which was true. "I do fraud investigation for a living, Mom." "That's the job you've been calling paperwork for 4 years." I watched something collapse in her face that had nothing to do with Richard Whitfield and everything to do with the sudden understanding that the daughter she'd handed an apron to had spent the last several hours quietly doing the one thing in that entire tent that actually mattered. The investigation moved fast once agents had what they needed from the wedding, Richard's laptop, seized that night, statements from a dozen guests who suddenly had a lot to say, and financial records that, once subpoenaed, showed a pattern going back nearly 3 years. Meridian Capital Partners had never had the returns it claimed. New investor deposits paid out old investor returns, classic and almost boringly textbook once you saw the shape of it, except that the human cost wasn't boring at all. My father had put in $190,000, most of what he and my mother had left for retirement, 11 months before the wedding. After Richard personally walked him through the numbers, at a dinner I hadn't been invited to, Richard was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. He was denied bail, given the flight risk and the attempted overseas transfer. 5 months later, he pleaded guilty rather than face trial, in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation, 7 years, with restitution ordered that everyone in the family, including me, understood he would never fully be able to pay, because the money simply wasn't there anymore. It had been spent on carriage houses and raw bars and orchestras, and apparently, a very large boat he kept at a marina in Newport that nobody in my family had ever been invited to see. Tyler wasn't charged with anything. Investigators found no evidence he'd known what his father was doing, and for what it's worth, I believe that. He and Chloe separated 4 months after the wedding. Not because of some dramatic confrontation, but because, as Chloe told me later, crying in my apartment of all places, "I don't know how to be married to someone whose whole life turned out to be built on my dad's." She couldn't even finish the sentence. My parents lost almost everything they'd put into Meridian. The retirement fund is gone. My father, who is 64, picked up part-time consulting work he swore for years he'd never go back to. My mother stopped attending the country club events, where she used to talk about Richard like he was a family friend, rather than a business acquaintance who happened to be marrying into ours. 3 months after the wedding, my mother called me on a Tuesday night, which she never does. We're a family that texts, not calls, and asked if she could come over. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I do my actual work most nights, and she said, "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm only sorry because it worked out badly for us." "Then don't try to make it sound like something else," I said. "Just say it." "I'm sorry," she said. "I spent your whole life deciding what you were good for based on how you looked, and I never once asked what you actually did all day. I put you in an apron at your sister's wedding because I was embarrassed of you. And it turns out you were the only person in that entire tent who was doing something that mattered. I won't pretend that one conversation fixed 16 years of being the practical one while Chloe got to be the beautiful one. It didn't. We're still working on it, slowly, in the unglamorous way that most real repair actually happens, not in a single tearful scene, but in 100 small corrections. My mother catching herself now when she starts to say something is just paperwork. My father asking real questions about my work instead of nodding through it. Chloe and I are closer now than we've been since we were kids, oddly enough. She told me a few weeks ago that she used to resent how unbothered I seemed by all of it, and I told her that unbothered had just been the version of hurt I was allowed to show. She cried. I did too. I still have the apron. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe as a reminder that the year my family decided I wasn't pretty enough to stand in the photographs was the same year I turned out to be the only person paying close enough attention to notice the entire wedding was being funded by other people's stolen retirements. I'll take practical over pretty every single time.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want more fascinating Reddit tales, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to Archives of Reddit. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.